Now, I just want to give a little bit of a background on myself and my experience in the nuclear industry. I grew up in Perth. Like many people, I think in WA, I grew up in an environment that didn't like the nuclear industry. We didn't learn about it at school. I didn't see anything nuclear until the aircraft carrier would go engage roads and sit there going, that puppy's nuclear, and that's really cool. And then when I was about 12, The Simpsons came on TV. So that shows my age, right? And suddenly, I thought nuclear waste was green and sludgy and left out of drones. Because that's where I got my information. And there was no internet. So, funnily enough, you'd think that might be an out-of-date view, right? Well, earlier this year, in the Senate Estimates report, it was shown that The Simpsons is still one of the main areas that Australians get their information from the nuclear industry on. That's probably not the best place. So hopefully tonight you can get some knowledge from people who actually know what we're talking about. I won't include me, but these guys are absolutely fantastic at what they do. And so without much further ado, I do want to get into tonight's first speakers. We've got Adi, we've got Tony, we've got Jazz. And what I'll do is each time someone gets up, I'll give you a little bit of a speech about them. I'm not going to try and tell you how many with like degrees and PhDs and doctorates they all have. We're going to be here till we know. We will say a few things about everyone. And so the first speaker for tonight is Adi. So Adi is the former CEO of ANSTO, which is...
I was at ANSTO and I'm not playing green.
Yeah. And so, in addition to Adi's nuclear experience, he actually has experience and held patents, I believe, for lithium batteries, so renewables, and his previous experience in the wind industry as well. So, please take his information as not a nuclear one-sided person. He is probably the most well-rounded expert that I've ever met in terms of emissions-free energy. So, without further ado, Adi. Oh, and the last thing, I've got a real issue with Adi because he speaks a lot. So I'm going to keep him to 10 minutes. I'm going to shake him to 10 minutes if you go over time.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here in Collie. This is my first time in Collie. I spent a few days in WA during my time here. And it's such a pleasure to be in a place which is so intimately involved in the evolution of the planet Earth. We wouldn't have planet Earth if it wasn't for uranium. I don't know if you know this, but about 1.7 billion years ago there was a nuclear reactor operating in Gabon called the Oklo reactor. And there was so much highly enriched uranium at that time that reactor ran for a number of hundreds of years in Oklo. And then when they were looking for uranium, they found the Oklo deposit, but it was strangely depleted in the uranium as you'd expect to find it. So we wouldn't have a planet if we didn't have the heat that came from the decay of uranium. So our very existence as humans is dependent on the fact that this planet was formed with a big chunk of uranium in it. So be thankful for uranium if you haven't been up to now. It's a really amazing element. You know, in the deep history of Africa, the San people who live in the south of Africa have a unique language tradition. And if you explore that language tradition, it goes all the way up through Africa to Ethiopia and across the Arc of China and comes all the way to Australia with the people who first populated Australia. I had the good fortune when I was in the Department of Science and Technology of the post-apartheid government to run a traditional knowledge program. The deep and enduring knowledge that the people of Africa had. And then one day I found myself in Beijing in China, sitting with leaders of programs finding the indigenous knowledge from all over the world. And the first people that I knew rather deeply from Australia who know about the deep knowledge of the people who populated Australia before the arrival of the boat. I live in the southern China and often go down to where Captain Cook landed and put my feet on the ground. When I was in ANSTO, Les Bursell had written about the Dharawal community. linked to the Gungara community, go all the way through to Canberra and their tradition. And around the ANSTO site where we have that beautiful reactor, there are over 200 Aboriginal sites of significance. So I do feel that our nuclear history is rooted in the existence of the planet, but it's also rooted in all of us, whichever tradition we come out of. I come out of a Dutch and English tradition. My grandmother was Dutch, she moved into speaking English, and my father was from England. And so I'm a curious sort of South African who's become an Australian and have a terrible accent and I won't pretend to speak Australian tonight. So I just want to welcome everybody from all the different places that you represent and all the different positions that you represent. My personal tradition was the extreme left wing of South African politics, so if you think you're a lefty, you haven't been where I've been. And I'll talk to you afterwards if you want to share some really good stories. My mum was the chair of the Durban Parliament, which was to the left of the Liberals, who were banned by the apartheid government. And so I hope that you, if nothing else, will acknowledge that nuclear has deep roots in the left. And it's not really a thing about politics at all, frankly. It's about high quality, always on, reliable, low carbon, beautiful electrons in the shortest grid with the lowest cost to the consumer. That's the summary of what you will hear tonight. Now, why did I start there? I started there because, in a way, my journey to come to be the person who took on the reactor when it was finishing its commissioning was a journey through a group of people who I worked with. I developed seals for a high temperature sodium chloride battery. That battery was commercialized. That company ran in Switzerland for 3 years and it went bankrupt. That was a real shock to me. Because I just spent a whole lot of time, 2 patents, a whole bunch of years of my life developing a battery that everybody thought was going to change the world, and it didn't. In the lab next door to me was Mike Thackeray, who was a direct student of John Goodnight, who got the Nobel Prize for lithium batteries. He had a number of patents on lithium batteries. I helped sell the patents for those batteries to Toshiba, a company that you might have heard of from South Africa. And they are in the Toshiba batteries that might be in some of the phones that you've got at the moment. And so I've got a tradition that goes into your telephone as part of my history. I was involved in developing the first wind map of the eastern part of South Africa. It was a shock to me because I really, really believed that wind would power the eastern part of South Africa. The shock to me was to find that wind would only power the eastern part of South Africa for 2 days a week. In Australia, it's identical 40% of the time. It might be shocking for you to realize that we need electricity 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, high reliability, high quality electrons for our quality of life. 40% when you can't predict it is not going to cut it. I learned that in the eastern part of South Africa where people had no electricity at all. There was a small dam at the bottom of the area that we were working in the eastern part. And so we thought, well, what we would do then is we would use the intermittent wind to do a pumped hydro scheme, and then we'd run the water down the hill from the dam, and we would make electricity. We put the engineers onto that work, and we found that we could make electricity for the villages, the 2 villages that were near the dam, but the full eastern part of the Cape Province would not get electricity from the amount of wind that we could generate. My introduction to wind energy was to solve real problems for people who had no electricity at all. And it was sobering to me to find the intermittency of wind, even with pumped hydro. I think Snowy Hydro 2 is a pumped hydro scheme meant to work with wind. And watching what we do in Australia, I think back to my time in the eastern part of South Africa, and I think, how can a nation of engineers, sophisticated people, make the terrible mistake of rerunning the BC Dam project, with a bigger dam that's not really working, to be frank, called Snowy Hydro 2. So I'm bringing it to you today, not a nuclear bro who just woke up yesterday and discovered Australia. I've been in the energy business a long time. I anchored South Africa's hydrogen strategy under the Bush era hydrogen hype cycle in 2002. And that convinced me. At the time, South Africa was the second biggest hydrogen producer in the world at the Sasol plants up near Johannesburg. They knew how to make hydrogen. I mean, you didn't have to learn to spell hydrogen to be in South Africa and know that these people really knew what they were doing. They made oil from coal under the apartheid era to be free of having to import oil so they could run apartheid. That's where Sasol came from. It was German technology that was developed by Hitler to escape from the fact that the Germans did not have and had never had any coal. And that's why they regularly invade other countries to get it. Okay? So there's a deep history of hydrogen technology that goes right back to 1895. In fact, you can look from early cameras in the late 1890s, you can see an RAF Hindenburg disaster flying next to the pyramids. And we want to put that into aeroplanes now. I think it's really interesting to be a nuclear person, because over the last 40 years, we've been able to find out how to make nuclear power, third generation and fourth generation nuclear power, available at economic cost, safely, predictably, to countries that are very, very less developed than Australia. So to be in Australia, which maintains bans at 2 and sometimes 3 levels. When I got to ANSTO and we started to move nuclear medicine through some of the suburbs, there were still people, some of them in government today, who objected to the fact that we would transport nuclear medicines through their suburbs. There's some people in government today who broke into the Lucas Light site to stop the reactor being stopped. That reactor today provides nuclear medicine to people all over the world. Not just diagnostic nuclear medicine, but therapeutic nuclear medicine, based on lutetium developed in Germany, which we commercialized in the first 3 months of my time at ANSTO. But did you know that every aeroplane that you fly in that comes from the Western world, and many of the fast trains that you can go in countries that got them, have got silicon microchips in them, precision silicon microchips in them, that have in them the silicon that makes those chips is irradiated in the opal reactor to get the precision conductivity to make those chips. They've flown in their unirradiated form from Sweden in a carefully organized supply chain to ANSTO. They put into the opal reactor for specified periods of time, allowed to cool for 2 days, no residual radiation, put back into boxes and sent all the way back to Sweden. Your life depends, when you are in the air, on the opal reactor, which is nuclear device. Aren't you excited by that? You didn't know until now, but in fact, nuclear underpins nearly everything that's valuable in our lives. And so nuclear power is what my colleagues are going to do. Thank you very much.
Sorry, this is turn off again. I don't even know what. Thanks, Adi. I didn't have to hurry you up too much. Yeah, I know. So can everyone hear me without this? Yeah, okay. Not my day today, but technology is it? Next speaker today is Tony. Now, Tony and I have some shared nuclear history because Tony used to work at British Energy, which is the national nuclear energy company in the UK that operates the fleet of nuclear reactors there. Tony has worked on and commissioned 8 power reactors. And I'm not talking small reactors, they're the big ones. So if anyone has more experience in this field, frankly, globally, it's Tony. I'm not sure. Now, he also commissioned the open reactor, and that's how these two great friends got to know each other. Now, Tony and I both work for British Energy. Can you understand who worked there first, though? So, I came along a bit after Tony, but my role was actually selling the British nuclear fleet to the French, actually, long after Tony's departure. But Tony's going to talk to us today about power systems.
Okay, so what we're going to do is have a look at a nuclear reactor. So the first thing is, anybody here work at one of the coal-fired power stations? How it worked? So you're going to recognise this. So all this part is exactly the same as a coal-fired power station. So this is a pressurised water reactor. It's the most common reactor worldwide. 70% of the current fleet are these. 80% of the new ones being built are these. And it's got two circuits. So the fuel cell, the first circuit takes the heat out of the fuel and transfers into a steam generator. And then the steam generator, steam goes down to the turbine. So all this is conventional plant. So all this does is produce steam. So one of the questions is, well, what about the cooling water? You know, is there enough cooling water for a nuclear power reactor? This is a closed circuit. This is a closed circuit. So it's exactly the same as a coal-fired power station. So the requirement for cooling is just for the turbine condenser, the same as a coal-fired power station. So you've got three options for your cooling. If you've got enough water, you've got direct cooling. If you're limited, and a lot of coal-fired power stations are limited, you've got cooling towers. So you go through a cooling tower, so that reduces the amount of water you need. Or if you really haven't got enough, you can dry cool. So the biggest coal-fired power station on the eastern grid, Cogan's Creek, is dry cooled. So what they have is like a giant generator on the side to do the cooling water. So you've got options for cooling water. As far as the reactor is concerned, it all starts with this. So this is a nuclear fuel pellet. It's about the size of your small fingernail. And this is the same energy as a ton of coal in this little pellet. So it's a series of these pellets. It's about 300 in a tube. And then there's several tubes in here, in the reactor. So that produces all the heat from the reactor. What we've got for safety is a series of physical barriers. So we've got the fuel in the pellet, and then the pellet is within the can. The can's within the reactor vessel, and then you see the whole lot is got this big containment structure on the outside of it. So you've got multiple physical barriers. But then also we've got to keep the reactor always safe. So the first thing you do is, if you want to shut it down, drop in the control rods. That stops the fission reaction straight away. Even at Fukushima, that was the world's fourth biggest earthquake, and all the control rods inserted. So even in that worst earthquake, the reactor is safe from the earthquake. But then you've got to cool the reactor. So the normal way of cooling is use the same circuit, use the turbine bypass and the condenser. But if you haven't got the grid system and you haven't got all this part of it, then what we do now is have cooling water supplies within the containment. And these are now passive supplies in that they can use gravity, natural convection, conduction to remove the heat, to always guarantee that is safe. So you'd be relieved to know that radioactive waste isn't green slime. All we ever transport is solid waste. So we never transport or liquid at all. Routine day-to-day operation of the nuclear power plant only produces low-level waste. So the sort of things, this sort of thing, clothing material, wipes, etc., you put them in a drum. This is ANSTO's drum store. There's 9,000 drums in there from 60 years of operations. And you can stand beside it. It's very low radioactivity from those. Western Australia, far more advanced than anywhere else in Australia. You've got a low-level waste repository. You've achieved in a few years what we've been trying to do on the East Coast for 30 years now. So you've actually got a repository for low-level waste. So the thing we really have to manage is the used fuel. So this is the fuel when it's come out of the reactor. And it's very hot and it's very radioactive. So everybody initially puts it in the cooling pond. So the water provides cooling and it also provides shielding. About 4 meters of water above a fuel element. You can be standing on the top of the pond and look down. You're quite okay. And then you've got 4 options. Transfer to a dry cask, reprocess, which is recycling, disposal of the final repository, or use for fuel for an advanced reactor. So this is a dry cask in use throughout the world, particularly in countries that don't do reprocessing. So you put the fuel assembly into this inner cask, and then you've got an outer concrete cask. And these are good for 100 years, and it's naturally cooled itself. So that's an interim storage solution. A good solution is to recycle. So 96% of a fuel assembly you can recycle. You can get the uranium out, you can get the plutonium out, and you can use them. So France immediately reprocesses and use that plutonium for what they call mixed oxide fuel. So you need much less natural uranium because you've got this mixed oxide fuel. Reduces the volume, puts it in a better state. So all the fuel from ANSTO's reactor, from the Opal reactor, and from the previously the high-flow reactor, goes to France, is recycled, and it comes back as intermediate level waste. Or you can put it in a deep geological facility. So this is deep underground, 500 meters underground. This is the Swedish system, KBS3. So you've got the fuel pellet in the cladding tube, in a fuel assembly, put it in the copper canister, and then it goes deep underground. So this is the first in the world in Finland to go into operation. So it's having its final test now. It's been constructed, it's just waiting for an operating license, and it's going through these trials with dummy fuel at the moment to prove that all the system works. But this will be the first one in the world this year to go into operation as a final repository for used fuel. They've got the same in Sweden, Canada's looking at the same as well, and there's a similar one in France as well. So we've got solutions for waste, and we've got solutions for safe operation of the reactor.
This facility, some may know, I was the one who actually sat across the desk from the Premier and the EPA, the State Solicitor's Office, and environmental jobs, and everyone else, and negotiated the approvals for Sandy Ridge, and also negotiated an overtime agreement for that facility. So that facility was fully approved by the Indigenous partners, and to be clear, it was still actually shared by Paterson, I should mention that. But that facility gives this state an enormous capability that no other place in Australia has. And in fact, in terms of critical infrastructure to support heavy industry, that facility also supports other heavy industry like the oil and gas industry that creates radioactive waste, right? Because radioactive waste is created in many areas, including, for example, in the health industry. So we have fantastic infrastructure in WA, and actually we've got it approved. The WA government is fantastic. We've got it approved much quicker than the federal government has been able to try and do this. Our next speaker is Jazz. Jazz doesn't look scary, but I bet you she can probably kill you in 5,000 bucks. She spent 20 years as an officer in the army, but she also happens to be a nuclear engineer and is the head of the Women in Nuclear Forum in Australia, heavily involved in AUKUS, and is a global expert in nuclear security. So some of the stuff and the regulation stuff that you may worry about. So I will turn over to Jazz, and I'm going to go through a little litany
I'm not scary at all, man. I'm just a nerd who loves talking about nuclear science. But I'll see, because I've switched. Yeah, magic. Did you do that? So earlier this year, I moved back to WA after leaving army. And when I told people I was a nuclear engineer and I really love talking about nuclear, they went, oh yeah, this is a great solution for the East Coast. But WA doesn't mean nuclear, which got me curious. So I checked out the WA grid, and predominantly south, because I live in Perth and I care about having my air conditioner on in the summer. And realised coal is the god of energy in WA, and we just don't acknowledge it. Still 40% of the southwest's energy is supplied from coal, with 40%, another 40, out of gas. And renewables just making a slight touch there, which is an important part of an energy mix, but isn't doing the heavy lifting. And so when I thought about, hey, what would nuclear look like supporting the southwest grid? I did a little bit of math. Now bear with me if you don't like numbers. The current southwest Australian system requires 1.67-ish gigawatts of energy to power Perth, or WA. If 40% of that is currently being provided by coal and another 40 by gas, you've got about 80% there that is being delivered by fossil fuels. With only 20 from solar, wind, other. Now, the plan for WA is to increase its solar capacity by another 800 megawatts, so you've still got about 900 megawatts not accounted for once we start retiring some of these coal plants. So there is definitely a gap here, which I think nuclear can solve. Now, there's a thing called capacity factors. Those who don't work in the energy industry, it's where something like solar can't have a capacity factor of 100 because the sun is only up for maximum 12 hours a day. So it has much less than 50% capacity factor. Things like nuclear has a capacity factor of 95 to 99%. And coal, depending on the age of the plant, has between 40 to 60% capacity factor. So this means if we have 900 megawatts provided by a coal plant, you don't need a 900 megawatt nuclear plant to replace it. You can deal with something a lot smaller. So when I saw that system, I realised, hey, this small modular reactor would be pretty cool to have in WA. So I thought I'd give that background because a lot of people go, we don't need nuclear, but there is still that question mark about what places coal as a reliable energy form into the future. So I also did a bit of reading on the coal to nuclear transition, because in my role with Women in Nuclear, I'm passionate about workforce and getting a diverse and inclusive workforce in the nuclear sector and encouraging young people to study nuclear science and engineering, because I think it's pretty cool and it affects us every single day. So the US Department of Energy, because they are transferring a couple of their coal sites to nuclear sites, have produced a report. It's free online. Just Google US Department of Energy coal to nuclear transition. But the thing that I really enjoyed about that report were the stats around jobs. So with every single nuclear plant size, so we've got some small modular reactors, these are quite small, 100 megawatt, you've got your average SMR at 300 megawatt, and then going into your traditional large scale. With every single type of plant, there is an increase of jobs in those communities. And these are jobs that are nuclear-specific jobs, so nuclear engineers, people that work in reactor operations, and security-type jobs. With the remainder of the other jobs being upskilled and nuclearised, because a boilermaker is a boilermaker, whether they're making a boiler for a nuclear power plant or one for a coal-fired plant. So with some small nuclearisation, they remain in that workforce. That allows communities that were traditionally coal to thrive. Now, because there is an element of nuclearisation, these jobs are better paid because once you get nuclearised, you've got a raft of other skills you can provide in relation to health physics, radiation safety, and security fundamentals. And so a lot of these jobs are better paid by those systems and organisations, which means communities thrive a lot more as well. And if you talk to a lot of our women in nuclear friends, we geek out on different bits and pieces, and a lot of the communities around Canada, France, US that are around nuclear sites have thriving communities that have big sporting clubs, big community events, because there's money in the town to be able to do that. And so that was a really exciting part of that report as well. So for this second half of my presentation, I'm not talking so much about communities and power plants, I'm talking about radiation in everyday life. We are exposed to radiation every second of every day of our lives. Unless you live in a lead box, you will be exposed to radiation. So from the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, or ANSTO, they're the national regulator, they put out what the stats are for the Australian community. So on average, we're exposed to about 1.7 millisieverts, which is the unit of measure we use for radiation. Probably doesn't mean much to most people, but you're talking about an X-ray type scan. That's the level of exposure, even less than that really. So we're exposed to that every day. Things that contribute to our exposure: medical procedures, X-ray, dental X-ray, CT scan, any nuclear medical procedures if you have a cancer or need treatment for cancer is what we're exposed to. We're also exposed to terrestrial radiation. So just living on Earth, we're exposed to that. Natural uranium, radon, all these natural elements that are around us. Radon is the next one. Cosmic radiation, so we get exposed to rays from outer space. There's no way to block that. A lot of airline pilots and stewards are exposed to more radiation than nuclear power plant workers because they're so much closer to those cosmic rays, not being protected by buildings in their everyday job. And they're not actually classified as radiation workers, which is quite interesting because they get quite high exposure. Potassium in the body, we make radiation as well. If you love bananas, you're eating a little bit of radiation, and it's not all that bad for you. Uranium and thorium in the body, yep, more radiation that we produce. And then there is this little haze of radiation from atmospheric weapons testing that was done in the 50s that we've learned lessons from, and nuclear weapons are bad, and that is some of the consequences we still deal with today. So we are exposed to radiation every day. It is not a big scary thing that is unknown. But we have a really fabulous regulatory framework that allows us to make sure that everything we do in the nuclear and radiation industry is done under three main fundamentals: being safe, being secure so that people that want to do untoward things with materials don't get their hands on it, and being safeguarded. And safeguarded is making sure that nuclear material is being used for peaceful purposes and not being siphoned into a weapons program. So the Department of Health and Aged Care, that is the department that has the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Regulatory Agency. They look after nuclear safety, so they regulate the Opal reactor at Lewis Heights. They also regulate a lot of the national medical facilities, and they provide the standards and guidelines for radiation safety across Australia for both ionising and non-ionising radiation. So ionising radiation, things like potassium that can mutate cells, or things, non-ionising radiation, things like a 5G phone that are radio waves particles. So they've got some great fact sheets on their website if you're interested in radiation and nuclear safety. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they own the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office. So they really do the heavy lifting on behalf of the Australian government to make sure our nuclear materials are secured, and that anything we do around uranium, plutonium and thorium is being done for peaceful purposes only, and that we don't have an undercover organisation trying to produce high-enriched uranium for untoward activities. They have set the gold standard globally on security and safeguards and are often hunted down by other countries to help them develop their programs. And both of these have been running in Australia for decades and have done it under the covers because nuclear was a taboo word for so long, so they have just been quite professionals going about doing what they're doing. Now here from WA, we care about another regulator about to be established, the Australian Nuclear Naval Propulsion Safety Regulator. So if you want a tongue twister, say that one 3 times. They're still yet to be established. Their legislation has just gone through Parliament, but we are likely to see them around WA more and more as nuclear submarines and ships to do that. And so they will have great bits of information on their websites, and if you are interested in regulation, because nuclear is a very highly regulated industry, then I encourage you to have a look at that. I think that is me.
Thanks, Jazz. And there's a curious fact about ANSTO. So I mentioned I run a uranium company. I'm the public face of trying to overturn the uranium mining ban that we have in WA as well. So the federal ban for energy, we have a WA ban on uranium mining. We can mine anything in the state except uranium. But ANSTO takes their obligations so seriously, even when we do overturn the ban, we can mine uranium. We won't be able to put Australian uranium in Australia's nuclear submarines because that's classed as a military purpose. And Australia is so damn harsh on who we sell uranium to, we won't even sell it to our own navy. Which is bizarre. But we will cross that bridge in due course. We now have question time, and there's more than 45 people here. 45 people did include questions as part of the registration. We may have had some more, I guess, during the day, about 10 more. Thanks, James. So we'll quickly run through these. If your specific question doesn't get answered, you will get an email afterwards, as long as you gave us an email address. If you did and you have another question, write it down on a piece of paper, email us, follow me on Twitter, whatever you want, we'll get back to you. I understand you guys can't read this because I tried to from even the first row analysis. So I'm going to read these questions out. And then throw in one of our experts here. There's Elizabeth in the room, I hope. Elizabeth says, what safety measures will be put in place to prevent the human error that has caused previous meltdowns? Look, I'm assuming that mission over Three Mile Island and maybe Fukushima, being the three that everyone talks about. So Tony's got the mic.
Yeah, so there's sort of 3 clauses of absence. You know, equipment failures, you can have external events, or you can have human failures. So what we've tried to do is to make sure that human failures can't affect the safety of the reactor. So we do that by our automatic systems. So when a reactor trips and shuts down, there's an automatic system that comes into play and re-puts the cooling back on the reactor. So in the UK, after a reactor trip, I was locked out of the control systems for 30 minutes. As a shift manager, I could override that, but you have to have a very, very good reason to do that, because the automatic systems are so good. But what we've gone to now, instead of relying on outside electrical supplies and water supplies, etc., we use these passive systems. And as I showed you, these passive systems are within the reactor containment system, so they're not affected by the external problems, and they use gravity and natural convection, air operating tanks, etc. So all of these things to guarantee that you get cooling onto the reactor and remove that heat that you need to remove. A modern reactor, such as a Westinghouse AP1000, would have survived even the Fukushima accident because it will have its own cooling within the reactor and would have survived.
Thanks, Tony. And just to add to that, I actually have some experience on BK, a Chernobyl reactor, right? Because in London I was part of a project that we were doing for Lithuania, and as part of Lithuania's accession into the EU, one condition was they had to shut down that damn Chernobyl design reactor. The West just won't let them in because they were inherently poor design. And so, any concerns that sort of those kind of things would occur in Western reactors is just not something that the West's engineering and safety philosophy tolerates. Question next from Leonie. What is your justification for risking the safety of the people of Collie, the workers' environment and the planet with this proposal?
Yeah, I'm going to take this one on because I like meaty questions like this. So there is a great website called Our World in Data. When you type in safety records for energy systems around the world, they give you this beautiful report and graph. And nuclear is actually the safest of all the energy providing systems in the world. This includes solar, this includes wind and hydro. There are more deaths annually in the oil and gas and coal industry than nuclear has ever had. And so this misconception that nuclear is so dangerous to its workers is really based off of fear of not understanding how nuclear reactors work. And this is part of why we come here, is to be able to give people the facts around nuclear power and its safety record, because the data is all there. And I know not everybody is data-driven, and that there is a human side to that. But there are lots of stories shared by nuclear communities about the safety and what they believe is the safety around that. When we talk about the environment, I'm a bit of a nuclear tourist as well, and I love visiting nuclear sites whenever I travel. And a few years ago, pre-COVID, when we could travel wild and free, I got to go to Spain and visit a couple of facilities around Spain. And there was one amazing nuclear waste facility that looks after low-level and intermediate waste that is in the side of a mountain that has the most beautiful environmental landscape around it. There are deer walking through, there are wildflowers everywhere, there are bees, and they've got bee hives all around the site. Because a lot of the sites require exclusion zones for their safety purposes, the environment just gets to thrive because there aren't humans moving and interacting with it. So it's actually some of the most beautiful environmental landscapes you can see. Tony spoke about water, and water in France is a really big thing in the Champagne region, where my favourite drink is made. They use the water that has come out of nuclear facilities because it is great for their environment there. It hasn't touched the inside of the reactor, so it's not radioactive. It's just come through the cooling process there. So I think that there is a lot of evidence around the safety around people, as well as the protection of the environment when it comes to nuclear power facilities.
Thanks, Jasmin. I'm sure that question will be one that is regulated as we move through this. From Keith, can you provide a detailed risk management plan in the event of a catastrophic cooling system failure? Tony.
So part of the licensing process, you've got to get a license to construct an reactor and about that. So part of that process is you have to do a risk assessment for the reactor. So what you do is to go through all the accident scenarios, and in each of the scenarios you have to demonstrate that you can deal with that accident. So that's part of the safety case to get the license. Now, post-Fukushima have taken this to sort of another level now, and they've said, okay, we've proved in all these circumstances that the reactor is safe. But what if this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. So what you have to do now is to demonstrate that even in the worst of the situations, you've got alternative ways of pulling reactors. So we look at things like mobile equipment that you can plug in on site, and other sorts of supplies. And have you got enough staff to deal with a prolonged accident or a multiple reactor accidents on the same site? So there's a huge amount that goes into this risk assessment now to get a license.
I'll just make a quick comment on that. In our planning, when COVID started, we had a team in ANSTO because they understood what was happening medically, and we understood what was happening in terms of the ability to produce nuclear medicine. That we were able, we started about 3 days before the government, we were able to keep the local reactor operating by changing our shift patterns. So we could completely cover for people who had to self-isolate. Nobody broke any COVID rules, but the local reactor continued to operate and provide nuclear medicine to the world right throughout the COVID process. So you don't just have reactive safety, you have anticipatory planning for very extraordinary events. And I was so proud of the ANSTO team because people really changed their lives around because of COVID, but they changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world who could still get their nuclear medicines during the entire COVID process because we planned for weird contingencies, quite a which was covered.
Thanks, Adi. We're on to the topic of waste, which maybe someone can see there in the title, from Emma. How will Australia store the waste? Can it be located remotely now? Bear in mind, we have had a little chat already about the TELUS facility, that one very close to my heart, which can handle the low-level daily waste. It was Collie that talked about deep geological repositories, and actually what some don't know about TELUS, we're also working on a plan for a deep geological repository in Australia, actually, in the Northern Territory. But is there anything else you want to add to what we've already talked about in the presentation on waste? Can it be located remotely? The answer is yes.
I think if you look at the finished facility, that is granite. Okay, it's literally 300 meters of solid granite. If you've ever tried to drill through granite, you probably have some granite-like materials in your kitchen tops. You try and get through to 300 meters of that. So I think that's why Jazz has emphasised the security and safeguards piece. That deals with the human factors that are there. So when you've got all of the physical and that set of barriers, and you look at the human factors, there's no plausible way other than a war which would actually not be attacking your nuclear facilities, it would be taking out your grid. So you have no electrons, and then the nuclear facility is safely shut down, and everybody has a little holiday while the war goes on. You know what wars, by the way. Grids are very sensitive to modern drone warfare. And so the protection of grids is the greatest priority of all electrical planners, not the protection of the nuclear facilities. It's how can we keep the lights on when you have these dilute attacks on extensive infrastructure.
Another waste question from Kira. Will waste be permanently stored in Australia?
The answer is yes, and this is part of the Nuclear Safeguards Agreement that most countries in the world have signed. So if you use nuclear material for peaceful purposes, it is your responsibility to do the back end of that nuclear fuel cycle and dispose of waste. And so I know recently there was a lot of chat about the submarines, AUKUS submarines, and people being worried about US and UK waste being held in Australia. Due to safeguards agreements, that can't happen. The US and UK are responsible for their waste, and we're responsible for our waste. So being good nuclear citizens, it is our obligation and responsibility to dispose of our waste safely and securely. And so it will be stored in Australia, and the government has an obligation to provide us a location for the National Waste Facility, which they haven't yet announced, and I wait eagerly to find out where it's at.
And that's a good question. So, when and having the waste repository, after you're going through the trouble of building one, and the vast majority of cost is in the community consultation and the regulatory process. The actual building of it is once you've got your facility, this wonderful facility, you want to put every last ton of waste you can in there, so that you increase utilisation and drop the cost per tonne of going into it. So the government will be building and spending, a lot of time in community building a national repository for that August waste. That is, it makes perfect sense, therefore, to use that same highly regulated, fully approved facility. You want to increase the tonnage of civilian waste in there as well. We'll reduce the overall cost per tonne and makes good economic sense. From Lindsay, is it possible to recycle nuclear waste to make it useful for different technologies? Sounds like Lindsay knows what she's talking about. Yes.
I covered reprocessing and recycling, so you can do that, remove the uranium and plutonium and reuse it. But the other option I listed, but I didn't go into, was burning the reactor. So some of the Generation 4 reactors that we're looking at can use the fuel from these existing reactors, the water reactors, and use that as fuel for their reactors. And then you get a lot less waste produced. So this is really the ultimate solution for the use fuel from the reactors. Burn it in the next generation reactors, save all the fuel, have a lot less final waste as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting with existing reprocessing, publishing is with recycling because everyone understands what that is and like that. Existing tech, it comes down to economics, right? So the reason that you might not use more recycled metals, it comes down to cost. Right now, depending on the commodity price, it's cheaper to mine it than it is to reprocess and recycle it. It's exactly the same thing. Water usage, we talked a little bit about this, I'm assuming Tony's going to get this, but I'm guessing here. From Hero, will a nuclear reactor at Collie require water cooling? If so, what will be the consequences for Lake Wellington?
So, as I briefly mentioned, the real use of cooling water is fully turbine condenser. So it's exactly the same as the power station. And you've got the three options of either direct pulse through cooling through condenser, indirect cooling with cooling towers, so that if you're limited, you can use the cooling towers, or you can go to dry cooling if you really haven't got any. That's for the existing sort of reactors that we looked at, the pressurised water reactor, most common reactor presently worldwide. But when you look at the next generation reactors, the generation 4 reactors, and you've got reactors that are like very high temperature reactors, don't use cooling water, don't use a normal steam turbine system. You can then go to a gas turbine cycle. So you're not going to use any cooling water then. So there's going to be some changes when we go to the generation 4 reactors that enable reactors, not to have a need for any cooling water like that.
Thank you. Question from Paul. Isn't it concerning that Collie may not be suitable for water supplies and wastewater discharge, particularly for coal-fired power, given the current drying climate?
Maybe I'll take that from the point of view of that water use versus other water use. All of the water that tends to go through these secondary and tertiary cycles in the plants is done by some sort of evaporative cooling. It goes up in the air, forms clouds, falls back down. So you're actually using water, but the water is not being used up. And so some of the comments that we've seen about nuclear is that you're using up water overnight, you're using water for cooling, but it goes back into the normal systems that we use, the river that was running past in the case of France, or up in the atmosphere if you're using a dry cooling, which uses evaporation. So I think one of the really important things is that reactors do not use up water. They use water for cooling in the same way that they use water for bath. It's just, your bath cools and you get Then you're using water up, no you're not, you're using water, goes down the drain, and reappears somewhere else. The key thing is that if you've made a mess of that water, you should put it through a cleaning system, which most cities now do, but some people don't. Same with the reactor. Water comes out is just as clean as when it went in.
Okay. A question from Kathy. Could you provide a technical answer regarding water use, water sources and water quality? Given my background as an industrial chemist, whoever Kathy is.
So, Kathy, I'm not an industrial chemist, but University of New South Wales recently published a report that looked exactly at this. What were the impacts of water with nuclear power? I'm pretty sure you can find it online. If not, the ABC did a big article talking to it. But long story short, the water quality is the same as it came in. There's no radiological impacts on it at all.
Next group of questions on location from Hugh. The coal plants are in Collie because that's where the coal is. If we were to build a nuclear power plant that doesn't rely on coal, would it make more sense to have it closer to an industrial precinct like Banana to have the transmission losses?
I think a few of us would probably want to answer this, because I would say from a community perspective, you've already got a community that has the skills, knowledge, experience in running wind power. And so from a community and workforce perspective, Collie makes good sense. Banana, you need to build a whole new community that will do that.
So I look at it from an infrastructure basis. So you've got a major transmission connection already, so you don't have to have additional transmission. And you've got the other infrastructure on the side. So you've got the cooling water supplies, even the buildings. So if you convert one of these coal-fired power stations that is retired to nuclear, you can save quite a lot of money on the cost by reusing this infrastructure.
Yeah, I think people don't realise that there are three grids. There's the transmission grid, which is the big poles and wires. There's the distribution grid, which comes into towns and cities and gets it closer to you. And then there's the local grid, which is the poles and wires that you normally think about when you think about the grid which is close to your home or close to your factory. The transmission grid is very expensive. It's highly intrusive ecologically, and it affects the communities it goes through because they didn't have grids and suddenly they got grids. If you build nuclear plants where there are existing plants, you don't have to expand the transmission grid. If you build lots of wind and solar and double the size of the transmission grid for the same number of electrons, that's 40% of your electricity cost, your bill will go up. Okay, this is just the laws of economics, it's not really like wind, right? So the bottom line is that at the transmission level, the obvious thing to do is to only build new transmission when you're building new industries, cities and other things, and then to place your power sources, small or medium reactors that are replacing existing sources. However, for regional and rural communities, and for the north of Australia, where I've done some work in Bergtown, for example, they run a thing called the SWIR grid, single wire earth return. That's the grid where there is no grid. Does anybody know, somebody know who lives on a SWIR grid? Yeah, one. So you don't know about, the 5% of Australia that doesn't have a grid as well. They need small modular reactors and they need nuclear batteries because they don't want the diesel grid. And so the diesel runs in Cairns and it goes in trucks all the way across the top of northern Australia, right the way, through Queensland and into northern Australia. You did not know about the diesel grid. The diesel grid is a disaster for those communities. And it would be great if we could become the micro-reactor leader of the world, and on slabs of cement the size of a container, give them 7 to 10 years of reliable power with a nuclear reactor, and take it off the diesel grid forever. Please join the diesel grid movement, which I'm starting here today.
Revolution.
The amount of truck drivers that drive that diesel, they're too happy with you.
All of you working in the plants.
Question from Wendy on location as well about infrastructure here. What existing infrastructure for the power stations are going to be reused? One of the things that is interesting overseas where you have these, actually you end up having towns bidding for nuclear power stations because of the economic multiplier that happens now. That is obviously dependent on those towns being comfortable with nuclear. And I want to just mention quickly the Simpsons. So I talked about that before, right? So the Simpsons, there has been research on this. The Simpsons has had a negative impact on the perception of nuclear in Australia, but it has not had the same impact in the US where it's from, and it's equally as popular. Now, the reason is because actually the US is already such everyday interaction with the nuclear industry that they're already pretty comfortable with it, and therefore you get things like bidding for towns to host new plants. But over the experts actually answer that question. Reuse infrastructure and implementation.
So, free electricity for people to get the plants. I think there's a kind of a sting in the tail there because it suggests there's something negative about getting the plants. We have to compensate you with free energy. You will basically get the energy that comes directly off the plant, and there's no reason why that shouldn't go straight into a distribution grid with a step-down transformer, and you get a lower cost of electricity because it doesn't have to go through the grid, so that can be automatically done. My view is there should not be an incentive for free electricity, because what happens when you put the fence? Those people are still close to that facility, and you've just created an A team and a B team. I think it's bad politics. I think it's poor thought. I wouldn't do it if I wasn't in charge. I'm not in charge.
I'll take a step at the infrastructure part.
Okay.
So it's really when Tony described the reactor and the containment vessel, anything outside of that helps create the electricity and put it to the grid is all the infrastructure that can be reused from the coal side of the house.
I was just going to make a quick joke there. The problem, Tony, the problem, Adi, is that, if there was free electricity for the town, they would start hydroponic. Because we're in the southwest here, and everyone's power using those sort of problems. Don't recall that joke. Right, reactor specifics. Steve, what is the current procedures for decommissioning the plant? A plant? Let's call it A plant. Post-working life, what's the current world's best practice on decommissioning? You want to talk about Python? Or other decommissioning?
We'll start with big nuclear power plants. So when it comes to the end of its life and it shuts down, it goes through decommissioning. So the first thing you do is remove all the fuel. So once you defuel the reactor, you've taken away all the major safety hazards. You've taken away really most of the radioactivity from the. So you've done that. You've then got the reactor sort of vessel containment at the outside. There's then a couple of approaches that have been done. Now, some countries have gone for immediate decommissioning. So they take the whole reactor apart and decommission it. The advantage there is that you've got the people that are used to that reactor, and the disadvantage is that it's more radioactive. So, you've got to have perhaps more remote decommissioning, more precautions for it. But you can convert it into a green site a lot quicker. The other option that some countries do is to delay it for, say, about 20 years. The advantage then is that the radioactivity has decreased, so it's a lot easier to work on and decommission. The disadvantage is that you might have lost the people with all the knowledge of the plant. And of course you can't actually use that site until it's been decommissioned. So there's a couple of main options, and different countries want different approaches to this.
I think it comes down to the amount of land that those countries have. So typically countries that have got high population densities and reactors close to communities tend to completely decommission early. And those that have got larger areas tend to think about it a variety of ways. do things. But the bottom line is that people are struggling to decommission coal plants, deal with the slime standards. We know about the disasters from coal in parts of the UK. So I think every decommissioning site has got its particular challenges. The great benefit of nuclear is because of the high energy density of the fuel. The waste streams are not a huge, big issue if you decommission. It's a balance of voltage. That's the challenge.
Interesting in the environment we find ourselves in today. Germany closed down prematurely the whole bunch of plants. Last year, and lo and behold, now they want to restart. And so the delay decommissioning approach that Tony mentioned actually has another benefit. Wesley, right? Thorium. What is the difference, advantage and disadvantage of thorium versus uranium? Thorium is another radiation source.
Okay, so people get quite excited about thorium. What you have to remember is thorium is not a fuel. So you can't put thorium into a reactor, pull the control rods out, nothing happens, because it doesn't actually fission. So what you do is you put thorium into a reactor, which has got uranium in it, which produces neutrons. And that neutrons then hits the thorium and converts the thorium eventually into another form of uranium, uranium-235. So the normal fission point of uranium is uranium-235. This converts it into uranium-233 instead. And then you can use that uranium-233 in a reactor. So with a normal reactor, because you've got uranium-235 and 238, and that gets bombarded with neutrons, you get these low lift wastes because you get 238 irradiated, and that produces these longer lift isotopes. The advantage of thorium is if you can get to a site where you've got enough uranium-233 to fuel the reactor and produce the neutrons to irradiate the thorium, then the whole waste is a lot less. So the thorium cycle, if you can get to the far end of it and produce enough uranium-233 and have the whole thorium cycle, won't be good. But initially, you've got to produce enough 233 to make that low-level waste cycle work.
And that's challenging.
Well, you're about to answer another question, you guys, actually, because this is on thorium liquid salt reactors as well from Mark. Just why didn't the US or other atomic energy nations commercialise those reactors, and why do they go with uranium-rich uranium reactors? And if Australia would pursue nuclear energy, should they be considered as part of the mix?
I think that we're now living in a uranium age, and it's working pretty well. We know what to do with the stuff. And as you've been hearing, most of the waste issues and waste processing is actually not scary, and the volumes are quite small, and the people like closing a fuel cycle and a repository and economics for the works. It's a great example where they built a reactor that cost too much and took too long, and they switched it on, and the price of electricity went down to 30% of what it had. So we've done that experiment. And the reason that the uranium cycle works so well is because so many countries in slightly different ways have done different things in the uranium cycle that you've got a lot of options to close the fuel cycle and deal with waste. I think only a really big country that had no uranium, like 3, and you would want to live there, will do thorium, and they might get the thorium cycle going. But really, I think that the logical thing is to go with uranium, unless you're Oklo 1.7 billion years ago where it's already operating.
So molten salt reactors, the US were trying everything in the early days, and they tried molten salt. And it was actually originally intended to power aircraft. So they thought it was going to be a good idea to have a lot of salt reactor power aircraft. Fortunately, he never threw in anger, which I think is probably a good thing. But the US really dropped lots of salt reactors in favour of uranium because there were a lot of material challenges at the time. So molten salt is very corrosive. You're looking for special materials that can withstand a lot. Generation 4 reactors, one of those is no molten salt, one is very high temperature reactors. Both of those, Australia is really interested in now. And a lot of it is thanks to ANSTO and the material capabilities of ANSTO. This is why a lot of the rest of the world want ANSTO's knowledge and technology. But ANSTO is very, very strong in advanced materials for these sort of applications. But there's quite a lot of interesting developments worldwide with molten salt. Both China have got a thorium molten salt reactor, which is just starting off a very small one, but they're going into small steps forward. The US is certainly looking at molten salt. There's terrestrial energy in Canada, which is going to work as well. So I think now what's happening is some of these material challenges are being overcome. We're starting to see some of the advantages. You don't have to manufacture the fuel because the fuel is dissolved in the salt, so you don't have to do that part of it. But you certainly got other challenges with molten salt.
It's Adi mentioned a couple of times how the Finnish experience and the fact that it was over budget still got power prices. The Finns built something called the EPR, European Pressurised Water Reactor, which is a French design. Now I'm going to go out and look here. Does anyone here own a French car? We've got a couple. Well, they're rare. Well, it's like having a pneumatic suspension on a car. The French parts have like twice the amount of moving pieces as the Korean or the American design. So I think one thing we won't do in this country is build the sorry all you pleasure a question for Brian. Can you please tell us if the nuclear power plant does get built Collie, or how big we talk? Gigawatts or megawatts of levels?
So I think around 300 megawatts electric is good for the size of the grid and for what's already planned by the West Australian government to build. Throw a spanner in the works though, is there an increasing AI and data centre interest here in WA? And if the answer is yes, then that will exponentially grow. And you will potentially want either a 500 megawatt or potentially up to 1,000 megawatt reactor. So I guess that's the big unknown. And until we can solve nuclear being in Australia, we don't really know what the AI and data centre industry want to do because they need 24/365 stable power. They can't deal with a renewable grid. It's just catastrophic to their industry.
Yeah, that's interesting, Jeff. In my role, I talk to data centre CEOs who are currently constrained in Australia. They cannot grow in Australia, they don't have enough power. It's funny because the data centres, the biggest operator of data centres in Australia is the government. And the head of the government data centres is the one telling me that they cannot do renewables. They're like, oh.
It blows my mind.
Well, I wanted to talk to someone up the tree.
Yeah, we want our data here on shore so no one can exploit it, yet you don't put power rates.
Well, renewables, and let's not renewables bash you guys, just to...
renewables have a place.
Exactly, good, okay. From Gary, there's two parts. Could you provide a cost comparison shows, or describe at least, the total cost of creating and maintaining wind turbine solar power and nuclear energy over a period equal to the expected lifespan of a nuclear plant, say 50 years?
Yeah, there's interest. There's really good published referee engineering literature on this course. Hello. Are you going to try again? There you go, Channel 4. Okay. Sorry about that. There is good published engineering referee literature in proper journals. The name of the author is Robert Idel, R-O-B-E-R-T, conventional I-D-E-L. The levelized full system cost of electricity. That paper started the table 5. The first 3 pages will take you 3 days. He sets up the case beautifully and then runs the mathematics for Germany and for Texas on real grids, not pretend grids. And he demonstrates that the lowest cost of electricity in Texas and Germany, both of which tried to give up nuclear, is nuclear power plus the other things in the appropriate mix. And so the answer is, as President Obama said, I was in Washington in the room when he said this, when he was asked a question by a journalist who was talking over there. The journalist was about there, I was sitting about here, and said, President Obama, which do you choose? And gave a list of all of the forms. He said, that's a great question. All of the above.
So I'm going to go off script here, guys, for a second. Chris Bowen was down in Collie recently, and we've got new big batteries being built here. Chris fairly famously relies on the gen cost modelling done by CSIRO, which I have a feeling that question there was kind of alluding to it. And so this is why I was for a moment. Adi, you open the doors of an elevator and you see Chris Bowen standing there.
Yeah.
What are you going to tell them?
If it's on the ground floor, I would say, Minister Bowen, we've got the time to get to the top floor of this building. The most important thing is, if you want to be able to use this lift in 5 to 10 years' time, is you need to deeply understand how reliable energy that is always on and that is highly predictable and it has got high quality 50 hertz, that beautiful sine wave that we use, is essential to a modern economy. And even if you don't want an industrial economy, we're halfway up, you might want to have data centers, and you might want to have the next generation and whatever happens beyond those data centers. You will not do that without really high quality electrons, and you will not defend this country without the ability to use your grid, not just for electrons, but as a timing device for every precision procedure that you run. The clock of many procedures in Australia is being lost. Thousands of jobs have left South Australia and reappeared on the west coast of the United States, and you don't know about it because they all left under secrecy agreements, because the quality of the electricity in South Australia with our famous very renewable grid is so bad. You do not want to be in the lift with me, Minister Bowen, if we get to the bottom and you have not changed your mind. Okay?
And that's a few times that AI has come up, and I'll to give a little bit of an example. Jazz, I think you said,
just one more comment.
Okay.
The gen cost report is really important because the government take that as the evidence that renewables is cheaper. So CSIRO and AGO jointly produced that report. CSIRO don't have engineers that know about these technologies. So they get Oricon to provide all the technical details. Oricon provide all the costings, etc. And look at worldwide projects. And they do a really good job. But Oricon don't do nuclear. So where does CSIRO get the nuclear figures from? They make them up themselves. And every year, I comment on this report, and I've actually talked to the authors and said, you really need to get a nuclear consultancy to give you the right figures, because at the moment, you're just using the wrong figures. The government isn't getting the advice it needs to make the right decisions.
So AI has been mentioned a couple of times. Jazz, you mentioned the regular sort of demand from the entire Swiss is 1.7 gigawatts to 2.something gigawatts. I think the highest ever demand in the Swiss on one day, which is in February this year, was 4.2 gigawatts. Right? Sam Altman, who's the father of modern AI, wants to build new data centres in the US, single shed, 5 gigawatts of baseload power in each one. So that is like double the entire Swiss. And if anyone thinks we do that on renewables, that would be a very large system. Kathy, on renewables, I'm interested in the capacity, this is a long question, sorry. I'm interested in the capacity of the WA Swiss market for baseload power both now and into the future. Specifically, I want to understand how flexible nuclear power is for load cycle, quick ramp up, and providing ancillary services like spinning reserve and load following. Don't you love it? Going into like an energy intelligent community. You get these questions. Given this, do solar, wind and batteries offer better technical solutions to the current future power demands of the Swiss compared to baseload sources such as?
Yeah.
So nuclear can load follow. You think of France, 80% nuclear. They load follow all the time. They have for years and years. So a nuclear can load follow. And all the modern reactors that are being produced now can load follow. So particularly with these smaller reactors, what you can do is a very fast load follow because you can go to the turbine bypass, so you can go straight to the condenser. So you can do a very quick load follow if you want to. Or if you've got a series of modules, you can run down each of those. So again, you can load follow. So the idea of nuclear being not able to load follow is just wrong now.
If you go onto the Nuclear Energy Agency website, you'll find reports on load following that date from the late 90s and early 2000s. The fleet in Europe has been load following all of that time. They do really, really well, and they do it with a change in the economics of less than 5% of the cost of electricity. The biggest problem with overbuilding with renewables is you've already increased the price because you've increased the size of the grid and you've built more than you need. By the way, with my battery history, batteries are buckets of electrons that are not primary sources. Okay, so don't confuse batteries with energy. Batteries are buckets. Okay, it's like actually taking buckets, filling up a bunch of buckets, and then doing your gliding for 6 weeks from the buckets that you've got instead of using the taps of the barge. It's the same amount of water, but you need a lot of buckets.
Okay, more on renewables and environment. Collie is a coal town surrounded by pristine farming country. This is from Russell, sorry. Please offer some thoughts on how a nuclear reactor at Muja would impact Collie and surrounds environmentally.
So environmentally, land-wise, it'll actually be less than the current footprint of a coal-fired power station because you're not storing any fuel on site. From an air quality and pollution perspective, the air quality is better around a nuclear power plant because the only thing that is being released is steam out of cooling towers. So environmentally, it's actually better. And then when you compare it to renewables, the land size footprint is exponentially smaller than a solar farm with the same capacity output or a wind farm with the same capacity output because they just take up so much more land. And so, especially when you're talking about farmland, you want them to be in places that aren't over the top of places you can use for agricultural purposes, which means it's further out of towns, which then increases the requirement for transmission lines to get that electricity to where it needs to go.
Yeah, the ecological lady would say that the impact on the Queensland ridges of wind turbines is devastatingly bad ecologically. You're killing birds. Birds are interesting, but it's the bats and the insects that do about 60% of the heavy lifting of the ecology of those forests. That 138 kilometres that they cut through those ridges and dynamite the ridges and put those things through is an act of environmental blasting, which I hope will be a story to everybody about the danger of not doing proper environmental and ecological studies. It'll be devastating to those ecosystems, and some of those haven't been properly studied. It's just shocking what has been done, and we should know better. We should know better.
I think there's a long-term so much more than required for nuclear. And then you've got the short lifetime, regular solar for 20 years. They're called renewables, because you have to keep renewing them for 20 years. So all the existing wind and solar will have to be replaced before 2050. And you don't ever see it costing for this, whereas nuclear is designed for 60-year life, and a lot of them in the US are now being extended to 80-year life, and ones we build here would have an 80-year life. So long-term sustainability for a nuclear power plant, I think, is far better than we've been saying.
One from Colin, the overall environmental footprint of kilowatt of nuclear compared to renewables with firming. It's interesting, the United Nations actually has really good European data on that, which they go into every single aspect you can imagine of the environment, including air, water use, carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic health impacts. And Stoke can't remember the link in front of me, but he's online, and it's fantastic to see that you can go through that really well. But over to you, Jasmin.
So I have middle-aged woman brain fog most of the time, so remembering numbers is hard for me. But Nuclear for Australia has put together a big fact sheets, and I know you're going to talk about that. But in one of these fact sheets, it talks about the land comparison of a nuclear power plant versus the exact same electricity capacity for a solar farm versus a wind turbine. I encourage you, if you are concerned about land usage, to look at some of those stats, because it is quite significant. And even though we are blessed with heaps of land here in Australia, we want to be able to use that land to the best of its ability, and sometimes I feel like we don't. So there is significant exponentially difference in land usage size, and nuclear has quite a small one. And small modular reactors at around 300 megawatt electric, you're talking about a soccer pitch size for the nuclear island of that facility, which is quite small. Like it is a small toilet.
I'm going to add another question in here. We talked about land use. A few weeks ago, Albo and the rest of the federal government here, they declared and announced an offshore wind precinct off the coast down here. A bit further off the coast than was originally intended and half the size. What's everyone's view on how offshore wind can fit into? Sorry, I know you had this one. Offshore wind into the grid and feed the Swiss. Will it happen?
Yeah, I was at the meeting in Cronulla this week, I think it was. I can't remember which week it is, but basically the day after that meeting, and I don't know, it was just a happy coincidence, they cancelled the crazy offshore wind plane off Cronulla, which they wouldn't have been on the seabed. There would have been 60-metre tethered things that had never been built. There's one experimental one in the world.
Floating offshore wind.
Yeah, this was for offshore wind. Most of the offshore wind that has been built is directly bolted onto the seabed. The first ones are coming to first refurbishment. There is no economic case for offshore wind if you can build wind on land. And so offshore wind in Australia is just a crazy concept. And it's based on all of the wind turbine companies that have spent very large amounts of money developing offshore wind. The only thing that they have in common is that they are all technically on their balance sheets bankrupt. And so they're coming to Australia last because we don't think before we buy. They think, but you be here now, don't buy it.
And on my hand, under the capacity investment scheme will guarantee a financial return to the offshore wind.
That's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
That's what
We'll pay for that for a while, yeah. Okay, question for us. How can jobs be transitioned? This is a question for you, Jazz. How can transition of jobs from coal to nuclear?
So the majority of jobs at a coal-fired plant can be transitioned to nuclear with some small nuclear upskilling. This is predominantly in things like radiation, health and safety, how to monitor your exposure if you're working in and around a reactor, security measures, reporting and regulation. So they're the things that are different to a coal-fired plant. For a lot of the trades, The bits that change from a trade perspective are around regulation of things. And I'll use welding, for example. In the US, there is a certain standard of welds that is required for nuclear facilities that is above and beyond what is required for every other industry. So for those trades, it would be upskilling to just increase the level of skill of those welders. This is why those jobs are higher paid, because they need more skills and training and education to do those jobs. And so there is a pathway to be able to do that coal to nuclear transition. And we're already uplifting nuclear literacy in both the trades and university sector because we have to for the AUKUS program. So these programs will already be in place if the moratorium gets lifted, hopefully in the near future.
Jasmin, a bit of a side note, there is that saying, you don't build a staff car park at wind farm. But you do build a big dynamic power station.
In the UK, this is what we did with all coal-fired power stations that been shut down. We retrained the staff for nuclear. Because if you're a turbine operator on a coal-fired power station, turbine operator on a nuclear power station, the turbines are basically all the same. And you can train the control room staff to operate a reactor and electrical system just the same as the coal-fired system.
In my first couple of weeks at ANSTO, I met with all of the unions. It was my funnest part of my early induction to ANSTO because they knew what was really happening in the organisation. They were very prepared to tell me. So we really worked to find ways that the people who had been involved in the union movement could diversify what they were doing. We set up a Toastmasters Club. We had a whole lot of things that were done internally to create a community in ANSTO that was not driven by a dynamic between management and the unions, but by a shared set of values. We wanted ANSTO to be the best multi-purpose reactor in the world that actually respected and honoured its workforce for everything that they did, because it's not always an easy job. And when you've got a really complex shift system and you're running a reactor and you've got people who are looking after it, you've got to know that the nerve system of a reactor are the people who work there. And the blokes who sit in the offices in office are there to make sure you fetch the money so that they pay them. That's the deal.
I think, as you mentioned earlier, that in your presentation, that those upskilled jobs come with generally increased pay. And that leads to the next question. Well, what are the local impacts to their local economy on building? That specifically says building, let's say building number.
Yeah, so the difference is a nuclear power plant has a workforce that stays in that community. They're not transient, they're not FIFO workers. They are working in and around that power plant, which then allows other parts of the community to grow. You will have a town centre, you'll have all the things that bolt onto a town. Grid-scale solar, grid-scale batteries, wind farms all have a transient workforce that come in, build it, and then they go back wherever they live. So that's, I think, the big economic difference with nuclear. Much like coal, it builds a community.
Yeah. We are at a shooting range for local police.
ANSTO,
Sorry, we're at
football fields, basketball
football fields, yeah, absolutely. And then beautiful walks in the bush. So we had a bushwalking club, and then everybody except the CEO also had a sense of humour.
I recommend anyone who hasn't been and check out the ANSTO facility. You've got to go and have it. It's fantastic. Right, boss, this is obviously a big one. And, so tonight we're actually, I hope you see, we're not actually trying to be that political, because what we're trying to do here is communicate about nuclear. And, this isn't an event sanctioned by the Green Party or wherever like that. But when we're looking at how the industry is perceived, and by neighbours are unfortunately not pro-nuclear yet, they've largely abandoned ideological. Chris Bubble has abandoned ideological opposition. He says, I can't be anti-safety because I'm having submarines, right? I can't worry about waste because I've got submarines. So the large focus from that the fitness for purpose question. So it's the cost from someone whose name starts with K, taking into account waste management, so full life cycle analysis, what's an actual total cost of constructing a nuclear power plant in Collie? And that doesn't say what's the relative cost of operations and everything else, but feel free to embellish.
So the cost of construction is essentially pretty well established. I mean, there's groups internationally that benchmark the costs across countries and various other things. So if you're talking about the plant itself, you can come to very much what the vendor cost that they give you on the contract that they sign, independent of the regulatory environment that happens in the country, assuming there's a supply chain. Assuming there's a supply chain. It is impossible to write down that cost on a piece of paper because the dominant cost of a nuclear power plant in any jurisdiction is driven by two things. Not the design itself, which is highly predictable and you can get from the method, and I'll give you an indicative cost of construction. It's your regulator who can slow it down. So the cost of building in the UK is lower than the cost of building in France because the regulator is more agile. The cost of building in France is higher than it is in Sweden because Swedish reactors apparently going to be built with the regulator that builds them faster, and then the Finnish regulator is slightly faster than the Swedish because they were impressed by the Swedish historically. That's true, by the way. And so the deep cultural roots of the trust that you have in your government that lead to your regulatory infrastructure, which drives a huge amount of the cost of it. But the universal law of building nuclear is build it when you have a supply chain. And that's the wonderful thing about AUKUS, because big chunks of the supply chain that we need for the big air nuclear part of the infrastructure will be built in Australia if we care enough. And that will mean that we have a nuclear supply chain. And as the subs start coming, and a whole lot of the 14,000 people who will be employed doing that will be saying, what do I do next? Do I go overseas to a nuclear civilian program to expand my CV? Or has my government been smart enough to lift all of the bans at 3 levels in some places, municipalities, state and federal, so that I can have a job in the civilian nuclear industry and hopefully in a nuclear battery industry and a small modular reactor industry because we're leading. If we do the right thing and we do it in the right order and we understand that it's not the cost of the plant, but it's the quality of the supply chain and the quality of the regulator, we will have the lowest cost.
Then can you, I'm adding again here, sorry, can you have a little bit of a chat around first to the client versus nth to the client? If anyone understands what it is.
Yeah. So what we don't want to do is to be a first of the kind in Australia. We don't want to be pioneering. So there's a mention there of South Korea and their reactors. So South Korea for many years now have been routinely building large reactors. And they very successfully exported them to the UAE and they'll basically build a big reactor there to budget. They've got that was a 1,400 megawatt reactor in UAE. It's a bit big for our grid system, but they've got a smaller version, the APR 1000, which would be ideal for us. And it's the one that the Czech Republic I've just looked at and said, they've signed contracts to say, yes, we like this reactor. South Korea has a supply chain really well established. They've got Doosan Heavy Industries, which is probably the best manufacturer of the large reactor vessels in the world. They do it for practically all the big reactors. So South Korea would be a good choice for a large reactor.
Yeah, and so you just answered the next question from Chris, which was why not get South Korea or Japan to do us a turnkey, because doing this in Australia is going to be problematic. So is there any other turnkey involvement of other international players? Anything else we can add in Chris's question?
I think that the other piece to think about is who's going to be your fuel supplier. And to see what the options are.
Yeah. West Australia,
I mean, you could lock in some of those things into the agreements and say that we'd love to use Aussie uranium. get Silex, which is on the corner of ANSTO, to build a Silex type of laser-based enrichment plant. In Australia, they're going to build one in the US, and that's a Aussie technology, which can be used for enrichment, and it takes you out of the old chemical processes, and knocks the atoms around the lasers. It's beautiful, and it's ours. And so we've got the opportunity to be in the fuel cycle, but it's predicated on the fact that communities like this, talk to the local and federal politicians and say, hey, this is not just about getting the power, it's being a powerful nation at the bottom corner of the Pacific, instead of a fading, little power, or a muddled power, as I sometimes call it. We could become, a force in this part of the Pacific for the peaceful use of nuclear in all sorts of countries which are emerging from poverty and which need the type of speeds that we have.
And a follow-up question is from Greg, and let's assume the 300 megawatt SMR is built in Collie. What's the refueling cost? And do you shut down the reactor when you refuel or when you refuel?
So the reactor I showed you, the pressurised water reactor, which is the most common reactor worldwide, is shut down for refueling. We take the reactor head off. They normally refuel about a third of the core every about 18 months. So it shuts down properly on a modern reactor about 2 weeks. And they do that refueling and they do maintenance at the same time. The only reactors that really refuel on low power are the Canadian type of reactors, so the CANDU reactors, heavy water reactors. Very successful in Canada and exported to a few countries. They're actually marketing a new version of that called the Monarch now, which is a 1,000 megawatt version. So that's another interesting one that we'd look at when we go to Australia.
So some can be fueled with bottom and some can't.
Yeah, and they're better than coal and about equivalent to gas. Yeah.
This one there. Okay. Timeline again. One of the main questions that I hear is, we just talk about nuclear, let's slow down because we work for the fossil fuel industry and we're trying to keep fossil on the line for longer. That seems to be well. What is the time frame from start to commissioning? Start the construction to commissioning and the availability of the reactor. Maybe ask UAE, the American experience.
We'll start with Australia.
Okay.
So Australia's
ANSTO.
a great example in ANSTO. So from announcement of the new Opal reactor, this is just the announcement, to full power was less than 9 years. So, if you really want to do it, you can. The UAE went from a stunning start. They didn't have anything. They didn't have any advantage that Australia's got of having a reactor already, or a regulator, or operating organisation. They didn't have any of that. But what they did do was develop a policy. They set up a regulator. They set up an implementing organisation. They looked around the world and saw what was which country, which vendor could actually build in time and cost. Selected South Korea. South Korea built them 4 reactors and basically on budget. And it would have been exactly on time. The construction was on time, but the operating staff weren't ready, so there was a delay before they got back to regulatory.
Yeah, that's amazing. The thing was built, yet the commissioning was delayed because the staff came to scratch.
So that's another big thing we did in the UK and that we did at the Opal reactor. And when you start constructing a reactor, you must have the operating staff appointed and start the training so that by the time the reactor is actually built, they're ready to take over and actually operate the reactor. They get involved with the commissioning, so they get a lot of experience. If anybody's done commissioning, you know that you gain an incredible amount of experience during the commissioning. This is especially true of a reactor, because once you get a reactor up and running, it sits there and operates, so you don't get all the experience you do during commissioning. So, you appoint the staff early, you train them, they're ready to go.
The question from Alan. How soon after the next general federal election can we get going installing car plants? But let me rephrase that. What needs to be done, right, before, assuming there is a change in government or the Labor government decides to bring it, what else needs to be done, and then how soon we get going?
My view is that if you've got a state government that is prepared to put in enabling legislation, like is happening with WA with the waste repository, which is just a remarkable achievement. I mean, if you don't know about the Teller story, it is just the most amazing achievement. Because something that the High Court knocked back from South Australia was already available in WA. So, the High Court of Australia is kind of it was a pretty obvious decision that they were going to make, and it took about 7 seconds to take, which is embarrassing. But the bottom line is, I believe that states and municipalities, Collies and WAs, should lead the debate, and then use your senators and your senator power to tip over the other senators from these urban elite communities who wouldn't even own a decent electron and ran them over in the street unless it was a Tesla, right?
Is that a decent electron?
Well, I'm not sure. It's a tricky one, but basically it's got to come to
you've got they're not even townies, they're urbies, right? They're urban environments, they're coffee shop centric. It's just, basically, I come from places where people have got no electrons, right? And this is a country which has got this sort of quasi funny federation that started with 3 people and then training, writing a book. And what we have to do is to say, this is our country, and the federal structure should be enabled to do the things that people want on the ground. People on the ground want cheap electrons that are low carbon. And the best source of nuclear. This is completely obvious to everybody, including Professor Bowen. But it's the long history of opposition that leads to the incrustation of the brain. And I really believe that most of these people would change if we just simply said, this is what we want on the ground. And that's why I think, the Berg towns, the Collies, this place where I love to spend time, because you meet the real Australian, not the latte sitting words like a speakerless now. Apparently it's going to be really small when you spend it with it. So this is what we're doing. And we can do nuclear, and they can have patents on their roots. Anyway, I'm getting excited.
I might add a bit more onto that. So some of the practicalities that need to occur. First thing is the moratorium ban needs to be lifted on generation of nuclear power, which needs to happen in the ANZ Act and the Environmental and Biodiversity Act. So both of those need to be lifted. Then the 2 regulators I mentioned need to be resourced to be able to build their regulations to include nuclear single power generation. That needs people, that needs procedures written, that needs agreements written with the Atomic Energy Agency. We need to build a workforce, so we need to either upskill current communities or entice young people to be excited by nuclear and get them through the system. And then you need the licensing to start building a reactor. So all of that takes time. Once you've got the license to start building, then as Tony said, depending on the vendor, and that also needs to be decided. Australia needs to agree on a fleet of reactors, not have the numbers are for reactors, because that's economic. I'm not an economics man. That's not economically viable. Once that happens, then you've got your quick construction to operations.
And a couple of things I guess I'd like to add. And I know immigration is a particularly hot topic in the election at the moment, but one thing that we can see as speed up that is say, okay, let's take all of government works, let's put in the new 482 visa categories, that's skilled migrants, and there are plenty of skilled, nuclear experienced people who like to come into the country. The second thing I'm going to harp on is on uranium, is I'd like to see uranium added to our critical minerals list. Now, what that will do is help the uranium industry come through and provide that front end of the nuclear value chain. And by putting on the critical minerals list, it just helps with states and with funding. And Mr. Dutton can get going and do all those things, assuming it's Mr. Dutton or Mr. Albanese that's creating a nuclear industry for us. While all those other things have been sorted out. So there's a number of things that you can get going right now.
Just a little bit, the second time I visited the MIT research reactor, which is literally, if you've been to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, it's 40 meters underground next to the main road that goes past MIT. And they took me around the reactor and I came and I said, look, I want to meet the reactor operator. I'm always interested to find out who they are. It was an Aussie woman who wanted to drive reactors in Australia and couldn't do it. So she was driving the MIT research reactor. It just tore my heart apart, She's at this iconic place, she's training people in different countries all over the world to find out how a reactor works. And what she'd love to do more than anything else in the world, this was years ago, so we've got other things, would be to be running a reactor in Australia. That is what we are doing to our young people. We're sending them on long trips to other countries to build their intellectual capacity when we could be doing it at home.
Okay, let's move on to grid questions. Gary, what area of the southwest will it supply power to as much as the current coal station in Auckland?
It's connected all to the same grid, right? So it will provide the same, it will provide power to the same grid that's established currently for the Swiss. Like there's no extra change.
And you mentioned with a different capacity availability factor, say a 300 or a 500, may actually provide more power than it does in the coal. Okay, question for Russell. Why would we necessarily have wind and solar in a nuclear power grid? I would have thought nuclear would do the job on its own.
I think this is probably the last question, and it's a really important question. And it goes back to Obama and all of the above. There are places that are going to be right on the edge of the grid where communities will want some of their own resilience they can generate for themselves, especially if they're on a flaky part of the current grid. It is essential that we don't say nuclear excludes other options. If we have an inclusive approach, and it's the best of all for all possible situations, then I think we will find the best mix. The work of Dr. Robert Barr, you can look up Nuclear for Climate, it's Aussies who've done this work, Robert Barr and Robert Barr. There is a graph that he has generated that says in all of the economic grids that he can think of and run the scenarios on, you could easily have 15 to 20% renewables and rapidly.
Well, I think the other part is from an energy security perspective, you want that diversity because you want the ability to have a flexible grid that you can support wherever the surge is needed.
Okay. And the last question actually from Ross said the same thing we talked about.
Yes, so I hope I answered that when I spoke about
Yeah.
the Swiss.
Okay, so again we have here a QR code. These are some of the actually fantastic resources that Nuclear Australia has on their website. They're fact sheets on various different aspects of the industry. You can use that QR code there, or you just go to the website, you can search Nuclear for Australia, you can search Anna's name, Nuclear for Australia will come up. And thoroughly recommend if you've got any questions, have a read. If not, get in contact. All we're here to do is answer questions and provide information. Now, we've had a lot of questions there, so if there were any questions we didn't get to, please give us that around for us up.
Can I just say that I'm the chair of Nuclear for Australia, and I was invited to do that by a remarkable young man called Will Shackle, who's busy writing his final exams in his final year at school. A couple of years ago, he had a dream in the middle of the night, I guess, and he decided he's a kind of a liberal arts sort of student, he's not a geek, that it was a really big problem we didn't have nuclear in Australia. And so for the last 2 years, he's built this organisation. We recently, I think, passed 200 people who've committed themselves to being part of Nuclear for Australia. It is the largest nuclear movement in the world among youth, the size of our population, anywhere in the world. He's a remarkable young man. I think we can bring this event to a conclusion by seeing how long you can applaud. We will record that and tell Will he paused at